And one of those synonyms that Jung has proposed for the self is the greater personality. And that's the particular entity I'm going to be talking about tonight. He introduces this term, greater personality, in his essay concerning rebirth, which is in Collected Works, Volume 9-1. And in that place, he speaks of individuation, quote, as a long, drawn-out process of inner transformation and rebirth into another being. And concerning that other being, he writes, quote, this other being is the other person in ourselves, that larger and greater personality maturing within us. It's the inner friend of the soul. That's why we take comfort whenever we find the friend and companion depicted in a ritual. For example, the friendship between Mithras and the sun god. It's the representation of a friendship between two men, which is simply the outer reflection of an inner fact. It reveals our relationship to that inner friend of the soul, into whom nature herself would like to change us. That other person who we also are, and yet can never attain to completely. We are that pair of Dioscuri, one of whom is mortal and the other immortal, and who, though always together, can never be made completely one. The transformation process strives to approximate them to one another, but our consciousness is aware of resistances because the other person seems strange and uncanny, and because we cannot get accustomed to the idea that we are not absolute master in our own house. We should always prefer to be I and nothing else. But we are confronted with that inner friend or foe, and whether he is our friend or our foe depends on ourselves. That's where he first introduces the term greater personality. But in that same essay, he describes the ego's encounter with the greater personality in these very important words. This is especially important quotation in my opinion. Quote, when a summit of life is reached, when the bud unfolds, and from the lesser, the greater emerges, then, as Nietzsche says, one becomes two, and the greater figure, which one always was, but which remained invisible, appears to the lesser personality with the force of a revelation. He who is truly and hopelessly little will always drag the revelation of the greater down to the level of his littleness, and will never understand that the day of judgment for his littleness has dawned. But the man who is inwardly great will know that the long-expected friend of his soul, the immortal one, has now really come to lead captivity captive, that is, to seize hold of him by whom this immortal had always been confined and held prisoner, and to make his life flow into that greater life, dash, a moment of deadliest peril, end quote. This final phrase comes as a shock after hearing the beautiful description of the ego's encounter with the greater personality. We learn only at the very end that the encounter is dangerous, deadly dangerous. This danger refers to the wounding effect that the self has on the ego on first encounter. At the worst, the meeting of ego and self can set off an overt psychosis. Even at best, the ego's first decisive meeting with the self brings about a painful humiliation and a demoralizing sense of defeat. As Jung puts it in another place, the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. This experience of wound or defeat is part of what I have spoken of as the Job archetype. I use that term because the story of Job is a particularly apt example of the pattern. And chief features of this pattern are four. And this is going to be the subject of my talk tonight. I'm going to give you examples of this pattern. So get these four features. Number one, there is an encounter between the ego and the greater personality, represented as God, angel, or superior being of some kind. Number two, there's a wound or a suffering of the ego as a result of this encounter. Three, in spite of the pain, the ego perseveres and endures the ordeal and persists in scrutinizing the experience in search of its meaning. And four, as a consequence of that perseverance, there is a divine revelation by which the ego is rewarded with some insight into the transpersonal psyche. So to repeat the four, there's an encounter, there's a wounding, there's perseverance, and there's revelation.